All right, then. Here we go. James P. Dowling is back with us again. So this chat we're going to have today has sort of spawned from the Jung To Live By Discord. The specific conversation we had about the anima and the animus was particularly well received because of James's high resolution articulation of these ideas. So we thought, why not try it again? And we're going to now talk about two separate but nonetheless very overlapping topics, and that is the shadow and complexes.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words there. I'm very humbled that the video that we did last time did very well. So thank you to everybody who watched that. That's surprised me. I believe it surprised you as well, mate. But yeah, let's just kick it off and see what the conversation brings.
100%. Absolutely. Something that was really cool that you said actually when we last spoke was the idea of how a complex can be blown out of the water once you tap into whatever the instinct is that undermines it. So it's a really obviously simplistic way to view a neurosis and a complex, but nonetheless, I thought that'd be a good place to start for you to explain to us what a complex is, because from my understanding as well, it is actually Carl Jung's original idea, a complex.
Yes. So in Jung's original, so complexes are the core of Jungian psychology, without a doubt. You can then put the anima and the animus in there as well, especially if they are defined as the relating function, which is certainly what Jung meant them to be. But his definition changed all over the place, and it got more and more mythological. That's just what you get with Jung as you go through his career. But the way Jung originally defined it was basically a bunch of ideas held together by a common emotional tone, which sounds easy enough to understand, but it's like, well, what the hell does that mean?
Yeah.
if we go to the works of the late, great, actually, Ernest Rossi, then he described a complex as a state-dependent memory learning behavior. That's much easier to understand. So state-dependent memory learning behavior. So, okay.
Can you unpack that?
Yeah, you've got memories, you've got things that you've learned, and you've got behaviors. And they're states dependent, socially. So you got complexes explain so much about a human being. So, you might say you're going through university or college, as they say in America, and you suddenly get involved in college football, or you suddenly get involved in collecting records or something like that. You might say that becomes your identity for a while. That would be a complex, because that's not you. That is a state dependent memory learning behavior. You've learned that, you've accrued it over your life, and it's state dependent. And when you leave college, you might completely utterly forget about college football. Something else changes and preoccupies you. Therefore, it is state dependent. That's kind of like a very, very sort of baseline example of what it can be. Obviously, that doesn't concern a clinician whatsoever. A clinician concerns it when complexes can become nasty. So we know that a human being needs to live in a certain way, not a canonical path through life per se, but there's a bandwidth fairly broad in which a human being can behave. One of them is we have to live in line with our instincts as much as we possibly can. So we need to eat or we die. We need to drink or else we die. The sexual urge, if you play around with that, it usually doesn't go very well. If you look at Panksepp's 7 basic emotional systems, then that's broadly what you can use to sort of get into what the instincts might be: panic, grief, play, things like that. And these are naturally expressed, say, by the genome. So the genome is constantly producing itself. And when the DNA is transcribed into mRNA or non-coding RNA, it's then translated into protein, and then that goes on into a systems biology fashion to form you. There's constant sort of turnover, and the instincts are always on. They could be turned off sometimes on an ultradian waveform, but they're always there, which means they're always being expressed. If you're having an anxiety attack or a panic attack or a depression attack, you can't argue with it. You can't. Try got someone in a panic attack and going, "Oh, why are you being anxious?" You can't. It's powerful. It's right in the level of instinct. It's the same thing with everything. The instinct takes control, not the ego. When you're hungry, you don't go eat. Normally, the instinct takes you to go eat, and you think that you do. So these things are always being expressed, and we have to live alongside them, or else problems come along. That's where complexes clinically can come in as useful. The other thing we've got to do is psychosocially adapt. Human beings, if you have a human being that's born and it's not touched by anybody, metaphorically, then they're not going to do very well. They're going to go strange. They're going to go mentally ill, and they're going to die. We need to adapt. We talked last time, I believe, about the 4-stage conformation model of a human being. That they need. There's a time and a place for mum. for dad, for friends, for a life partner. And then after that, in the second half of life, as Jung called it, for self-confirming. But young people, which, or broadly young people, say under 35 or something, which will probably be the bulk of your audience, I would guess, they are under instinctual pressure primarily to mate and relate. That ties into the psychosocial relating side of things. That's where the anima and the animus can come in. So you've got a human being that's naturally unfolding in that way. That's the canonical path through life. We can't disagree with those things. A complex becomes clinically valid when you have a state-dependent memory, learning, or behavior that then suppresses an instinct.
Yeah.
That's a problem, because then you get a division between instinct and the ego. The instincts can't come out, so they have to duct off elsewhere. So if you accrue something that stops you expressing an instinct, that's then a problem. So for example, I would use, everyone has complexes, and many of them are benign, some of them are good, some of them are bad. I'll use an example from myself, because just from personal experience. I internalized about 3 years ago the idea that the definition of masculinity was working non-stop, just for the sake of working. That's an idea, and it is state dependent. Meaning that if you change a biological state, for example, if I'm really exhausted, that complex is not going to come out. If you change the environment, and say you put 3 years ago, you put a beautiful anima image woman in front of me, that complex is going to go out of the water. It's state dependent.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's accrued learning behavior. And what that did is it's like, okay, so all the other instincts, let's just use play, for example, just take that one, just not being expressed. And other ones are also not being expressed either. And it's like, okay, you leave that for long enough and you go, you then get, and Ernest Rossi described this, the guy who coined the state-dependent memory learning behavior phrase. He described symptoms like anxiety and depression and things like that as most of the time, especially anxiety is the main one, as the most common one, as being a signal from the unconscious to say, change your ways, change your ways, change your ways. Because you could, you talk about an occultist, for example, someone who's into the occult. They could craft their own way of viewing the world and their own adaptation in the world. That's what lots of us think we can do when we're very young. The world is our oyster. We can do anything that we want within reason. But if you create something, a complex that is maladaptive, that's when it concerns a clinician, because then your instincts are not going to be able to be expressed. It stops them coming out. Serious religious systems is another obvious one. I think we mentioned about sex. You internalize a belief of a religious framework that's very powerful, that affects the whole of the psyche, and then other instincts aren't going to be expressed. And then you lead to neurosis in technical terms. Neurosis simply being a split. You're not aligned and going as one anymore. You have a complex that's gone no instinct, and they go like that. Complexes, I therefore think, are best explained in the context of that whole system of instinct as well. If that answers any questions.
Yeah, no, it certainly did. I think it's interesting to note that what you said before, using the football card collector as an example of a complex, and almost then you sort of expanded by saying most interests and things you do are in their own version complexes. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so then in that case, you can sort of just view your entire life through a series of different complexes, which isn't necessarily a bad thing to do. But you defined the crucial difference between what is a good complex and what is a bad complex. Can you somehow just draw a line? Is there like a knife's edge where good complex and then bad complex? Like,
Definitely.
what is that knife's edge?
Well, the obvious one is whether or not it's causing you pain. There's different levels. Obviously, there's acute pain, which is you experience hell, and it's like, okay, that's pain.
And this could be like a depression. Clearly, a series of bad complexes is causing a depression, for example.
Definitely, absolutely, definitely. Or it could be you're heading down a bad road. So, you might have a very, very, very strange set of beliefs or ideas about yourself or ideas about the world. You might say, we'll take conspiracy theories, for example, in the broadest sense as they're culturally called, because I would most of the time disagree with the term conspiracy theory based on the history of that. But let's just say the real way that the media might want to portray a conspiracy theorist. If someone wants to believe that, say, the Earth is flat, that's an internal, or some people say I identify as a flat earther. That's by definition a complex. Just like by saying I am an entrepreneur is a complex. That's not biological. It's an internalized set of ideas.
Mm.
But if you then become a flat earther to the point where you want to rip society down, that's bad, because that means you can't
It's turned into a
psychosocially
bad complex.
relate.
I wonder. It seems like, for me at least, it's hard to sort of conceptualize why I would view my life through a series of different complexes. Like, this is one complex, this is another complex. I think almost written into the word complex is this notion of negativity.
Mm.
Is that a fair assumption? Maybe that's just me.
Yeah,
But I
yeah,
hear the
it's
word
because
complex and I
it's when
think,
we
oh,
normally hear about it, isn't it? It's you have a superiority complex or an
mhm,
inferiority complex. Then yeah, most of the time when it's relevant, I think. But it's just an interesting way of framing it, to be like, at baseline, it's just memory, learning, behavior that you've accrued that's state dependent. So
yeah.
it's the bulk of what you see in clinical work. It's the bulk of what you see in your normal life. It's just, that's what we do. Take, I think we talked about introverts and shyness and stuff like that
Mhm.
last time. Just sort of, just carry things on from there. If Unless someone legitimately is, but they're not, to say I am a shy person is a complex, and that would be an ego identified complex,
Mhm.
meaning it's sitting right on top of the ego. Complexes can be defined based on their orientation around the ego, basically. So you can sit right
Yeah.
on the complex where you go, I am.
Mhm.
I am a flat earther, or I am
Mhm.
shy, or I am an introvert, I am an INTP. That's
Yeah.
ego aligned.
Because it's your self-identity, it's
Typology,
pure ego, right? Yeah.
yes, yeah, and typology is actually very potent for forming complexes. There's something about it that's it's likes to suck people in. It could be aligned to the ego, it can be unaligned to the ego, it could be in the shadow,
Mhm.
or broadly the personal unconscious. So that's just a way of thinking about it. When it comes negatively, complexes will operate negatively because, and the definition of a complex being bad is it takes you away from optimal psychosocial adaptation.
Right.
And complexes can also go down into your biology as well. They're psychobiological, which is quite scary. It's like when you're tired, for example, you might notice that negative complexes, in that strict sense that you might imagine, tend to come out more. They can tend to play. Or if
Maybe
you're hypercapnic, they can come out and play. There's all kinds of things with that.
it might be worth explaining why, when you are tired, a negative complex might find it an easier way to come out. Like, is that linked to your just energy? And if you're low energy and tired, like maybe there's less willpower stopping a bad complex, or am I understanding that correctly? Like, what's the link there?
Yeah, well, complexes, most of the time you operate on autopilot. There's a myth that in Jungian communities, and I understand where it comes from because of the way that the texts are written, that the purpose of life is to just raise consciousness. If you raise consciousness just as such completely, then you just become identified with everything in the environment. You would introject and project and identify with everything. So you don't want that. The purpose of consciousness is paradoxically to lower its own role. You want to be, in a way, in an autopilot state, and that's the instincts are flowing, and then you've got complexes that are good, that are working, and not bad ones that are going to come take you out. So for example, if you're actively trying to say self-improve, if you're tired, you're not going to do it. It's not going to happen unless you push and push and push, and then you form its own complex, and it gets harder and harder and harder and harder and harder.
Yeah.
For specifically tiredness, the main one, yes, would be would be the idea that you're lower energy. But there's also, when you're tired, you have an enormous change in your psychobiology. For example, if you pull an all-nighter, then your immune system this is what studies show anyway, your immune system the next morning is significantly weaker than it was the night before. That's going to be a part of it. You also have a psychological immune system as well that starts cleaning up these things too. When you connect to your instincts, for example, it's blown out of the water because it's more powerful than the complex, and then your psychological immune system comes and cleans it up, knowing it's not meant to be there. So yeah, they can become very, very, very pernicious. Complexes can breathe you, for example. You can literally be breathed by an autonomous thing in your head. As you know, I would never want to make, because I've been trained in the hypnotherapeutic tradition. I would never want to make suggestions on things like this. But in a technical sense, complexes have all of your intelligence and all of your potential because they're part of you, and complexes form for a reason. And they will therefore, like any living being or any living subset, if you poke it or you change something, it will try and adapt and survive. If I pour a very, very tiny amount of hydrochloric acid in your blood will readapt through a buffer solution to restore its homeostasis. Same thing with a complex. If you poke a complex, it will go whoop, and it will move. But the thing is, they seem to know exactly how to trick you. exactly how to trick you. You go after a complex in yourself and you might go, I know what I need to do now. And you end up in a worse possible problem where the complex can get further in control of you. And because they form, if they're if they're like a negative adaptation sense clinically, they form usually to protect you. This is the trauma theory of neurosis. So you might, we'll take the shyness, someone who's really shy. That's nothing to be proud of. That's neurotic because it means you cannot talk to people. That by definition of a human being is neurotic. It's like a dog who can't join in with the pack is neurotic. There's problems there. And it's like, okay, so there will be a complex that is formed there probably to protect that person when they were very young. Because you can imagine how when you were very young, being shy might be a really good idea to take you away from an abusive environment, for example. But then when you grow up, and in particular, if you're a very high potential person, and complexes have the same level of potential, as I've said, it will want you to stay shy. It will want you to, and you fight it, and you fight it, and you fight it, and it goes, no, I'm here to protect you. No, I'm going to protect you, because it's an autopilot adaptation that's switched on.
Yeah. And it's total, something you said as you were talking there was commenting on how all anxiety is bad, and it's linked to a negative complex traditionally, or at least most of the time. We can agree that everyone's anxious, or at least you could comment that modernity is way more anxious than maybe people were in the past. There seems to be a lot of bad complexes running through our societies. I definitely want to speak about, you as a depth psychologist, I'm sure have a lot of opinions on antidepressants, as do I, but I kind of want to leave that to later. But can you speak more about the anxieties for a bad complex? Because if you look at your life and you measure anxiety equals bad complex, then you sort of have like a starting point of where you need to tackle to improve yourself. Tackle the anxieties. What makes me anxious? Try and measure that back to what is then the complex associated with it.
Well, anxiety is obviously built into a human being. We will naturally get anxious if a predator comes along. It's the classic example. But in the modern world, we have something which is called, in CBT terms, which is, as far as I'm personally concerned, nonsense, generalized anxiety disorder. So it doesn't mean that, do people walk around with an anxiety disorder? As in, are they disordered with anxiety? Well, yeah, obviously. But it's usually like someone catches this thing and then they need to learn to manage it. That's so antithetical to the depth psychology way, and so antithetical to nature that it almost makes me want to weep with sadness. It's like anxiety.
This is a person that caught anxiety. They happen to just have a lot more anxieties than another person.
Yeah, it's like you wake up and I'm anxious. It's like, well, I'm just an anxious person. It's like, no, you're in technical terms, you're neurotic. And it's just it's what Freud would say. And it's like, okay, but anxiety can come on for any number of reasons. The most seemingly, I believe, the most common form of anxiety is attachment to the parents. So you might think that the anxiety is the problem. And this is where I mentioned Rossi's work, where he comes along and goes, anxiety is not the problem. Anxiety is a signal. Anxiety is a signal that you're psychosocially maladapted. Or obviously I would include biology in this as well, but generally neuroses and complexes form through a mismatch between your adaptation and the psychosocial environment. That causes a split, especially early on in childhood, the trauma theory of complexes forming. So in light of all of that, if you take anxiety as a signal, and anxiety can come in many different ways. It might be anxiety about, say, the future. You've got to break it down. So in a self-development sense, if you believe you're an anxious person, you've got to break it down. What's the ideation? What's really the emotional tone? And if it's a complex, it'll be state dependent by definition. Is it always on? Well, probably not. If it's always on, then you're not watching this video, unless you watch this type of video to calm down. So there's actually a riddle built into it, and it is a messenger to get your attention, because it gets your attention. But the problem is we don't listen to it. Instead, these days, and it's not individuals' faults, it's the structure's faults. We go symptom, get rid of, which for cancer, yeah. For something like this, this is a phenomenological experience. The most common is attachment anxiety to the parents. And this is obviously Freud's Oedipal complex, which has been significantly updated with neuropsychoanalysis, the work of Mark Solms, but it is real. It is really, really, really real. The bulk of complex work that you have is going to be father complex and mother
Mother
complex.
complex. Yeah.
And then you can look at something like the anima and the animus. So we'll take the anima, and it's like, is the anima any different from the mother complex? I don't think we know the answer to that definitively. But then we can really break down what a human being is in those terms. Be like, so what's the imperative that drives you forward in terms of instinct? And the experience of your mother, for example, may have shifted it so that you can't talk to women, and then you get anxious around women. Then you get talking to a woman, and she goes, "I'm going to take my top off now," or we're going to do something, and then you're like, "Oh my god!" And overwhelming anxiety comes on. It's like, well, I need to tackle the anxiety. No, you need to tackle your attachment to your mother. That's what you need to tackle. And then when you do that, your instincts go, hooray. And the ego will fight because of its own fictions, and complexes will fight. But it's about returning to homeostasis. That's the key thing with depth psychology, is adaptation. It might sound like a point that's sort of been done to death, even for myself in this conversation, but psychosocial adaptation is the key to all of it. That's relating properly. That's the proper function of the anima and the animus. And all anxiety is just a signal to come forward, because a complex is formed to separate you from the proper instinct to become yourself.
And to properly relate, it means you're more in touch with your instincts, right? Because that is that a good way to understand it?
Definitely.
But there is obviously the risk of just acting out of pure instinct, because we live in a social world and we can't just act out of pure instinct.
We got we can call it superego, we can call it a moral complex, call it a mother complex, a father complex. We are shaped by experiences that happen to us, and our innate character set, our innate genetics, that mean that we're probably not going to go around going on pure instinct all the time. You might have the instinct to go to the bathroom, but you're going to wait to find a bathroom. Maybe a crude example, but
speaking of the Oedipus complex, the Electra complex, mother and father complexes, you said they're probably the most common. Is that from experience, or is this like clinically known?
It is. If you look at, if you go through, well, clinically, when you go through someone's personal myth carefully and with respect, then most of the time, an issue in terms of pertaining to symptoms. So if someone's like, I've got anxiety, what can I do about it? I've got depression, what can I do about it? Most of the time, it involves the mother and the father. Most of the time.
Is this I'm just thinking perhaps the reason why mother and father complexes might be most common, let's just say, is that simply a case of they're the first complexes you get because they're in the earliest stages of your life, and because as a developing teenager into young adult, you're not really solving your complexes. They sort of just manifest and grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Could it be explained that way? The reason these are the most common complexes is just by the fact that you are with your mother and father as a child, rather than complexes that you might develop as an older man or an older woman. And then beyond that as well, what does it say about parenting that we all have these crippling complexes? Is it true that maybe you need to have some complexes to develop through life, and perhaps there's no sort of way that you can just be brought up without a complex? Because like it's quite a damning statement to make about all of our parents. And I actually said this in our last video, that perhaps the next generation of fathers might be, I don't know, better, because of the influence of Jordan Peterson that he's had on an entire generation of men. But I was like, okay, I don't want to just blame my parents for things, and do you know what I'm getting at here?
Well, it would never be any blame necessarily on the parents, because this is a lot with depth psychology. The whole blame, and even the idea of responsibility as it may be thrown around these days, is it's not quite right, because there's more to yourself than the ego. But when it comes to your mother and your father, it's like they usually did not go out of their way to specifically harm you. All the purpose of the mother and the father is to help build you into a socially capable human being who's mentally
Socialized
stable
person.
Pretty much, yeah. And so you can take, say, average guy, and you can say he wants to talk to a woman. Bring up that example because it's one of the strongest genomic imperatives that anyone would have. It's important if you're looking at a human being. It's like, okay, maybe one guy can go and be confident and talk to girls, another one can't. Is that because one of them's a weakling and needs to learn? Is that because one of them's a Chad naturally and he was just naturally great? Probably not. Probably not. It's probably the forces that had acted on him. And especially in today's world where you have the current culture at its baseline form, say a nanny state, we call it a nanny state. And if you look at what they're doing in terms of regulating speech, just broadly. They look at communism and what communism looks like, and the way that someone under a communistic state acts and is expected to look up at the state. Or, they talk about in China, we're on Zoom at the moment, Chinese, Mr. Xi Jinping or whatever is our glorious leader. It's like, you can look at parallels between that and the family, and you can look to see what the dominant is at the moment. The dominant culturally is that it's not, it's definitely skews left wing, but it's a pernicious, strange, not particularly old way of conducting society. And it's like, well, what the hell is that? It's akin to government in general. You could project parents onto that, but the way the state wants to look after us all is like a giant mother complex, and that will then keep feeding and feeding and feeding and feeding. So we have currently, we're living through it. I don't think we're past it yet. An epidemic, if you like, in non-judgmental terms, of young men wanting to self-improve. It's everywhere. I think everyone watching this video, if they're within that demographic, would have experienced that or currently experiencing that. And it's like, why have you got that imperative to do that? Why are you not improved?
Right.
Why not? It's like, that will be rooted probably, and it's a usual case, there are differences in the mother and the father in some capacity. And so it's not necessarily blaming the parents. It's like whatever the culture had contributed to them, or whatever their parents contributed to them. And it's a build-up effect over time, but we can't understate the importance of the culture in this.
Okay, so it sounds like you are coming to a point where we can actually, as an individual, as a society, raise children without having these mother and father complexes. So, like, from your analysis, just then, the culture has influenced our parents, then our parents have influenced us, and now we're going to go and influence our next children. And if you iterate enough down the line, and we are developing as a society, as individuals, then we might end up getting rid of the mother and father complexes.
Well, everyone will have a mother and father complex in baseline terms, because a complex is neither good nor bad. If you go back to sort of the beginning of this, it's state dependent memory, learning, behavior. So it's the experience of your parents, and because mother and father are, in Jungian terms, archetypal, or we would say instinctual categories, they are right at the heart of what shapes a human being. And so, yes, you could technically remove a negative influence of a mother and a father in a purely theoretical sense. Now, mothers and fathers are always human beings, and no human beings are perfect. And it's like, well, is any parent perfect? No. So does that mean that every child's messed up? Not really. No child's perfect. No child's perfect at all, but it probably doesn't matter. If they can get through the main stages of life and live a relatively happy life, from a Darwinian perspective, that's all that matters. They've completed themselves, and they're not going to complain about it. But then you look at what's happening with the culture right now. It's like, well, for example, with men, you can't be a man. You can't talk to women. That's rape culture. It's like, okay, you've now taken instinct and you've now put a fearful moral complex sitting on top that could well have resonance with an overprotective mother complex. And now you've got disaster. You've got disaster. You've got day in, day out, moment by moment by moment, fear. Then anxiety builds up. Then they go to the NHS to be like, oh, so I've got anxiety disorder now. It's like, yeah, of course you do. Of course you do. Because your instincts aren't coming out. We talk about on the channel so much instincts. We talk about complexes and the relating function. It's mainly those three things, instincts being right at the heart, because the culture at the moment does not encourage that at all. You want to talk about the shadow and projection onto groups and stuff like that. It becomes a disaster for young men, and that's what we see. And the same thing with young women as well. And it is usually, as I say, mother and father complex, which then affects the relating function, which is the anima or the animus, and how you can relate to the outside world and also to yourself. It affects your own self-concept and the way you look at that. And in an attempt at self-cure, you might start accruing other things. You might, for example, find Jordan Peterson's videos or Gary Vaynerchuk's videos, and it's only, well, that's the answer I'm looking for. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe that's enough to give you a step up to reconnect back to your instincts again. From my experience and Stephen Pauline's, probably not. It usually, in 99% of cases, leads to a further degeneration of neurosis, because it's not real. It's virtual. It's like a philosophical sense. It's not acted out. It's in your head, and then you can build up whatever models you want.
Path you're projecting onto.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. When really the best thing for you to do would be find yourself a peer group, reconnect to your instincts, get yourself a girl, get yourself a boy. Way better than I need to hustle, or I need to think about Nietzsche, or whatever the complexes that might be associated with our two audiences. That will just lead to more and more do. And the litmus test of that is, are you happy with that, or are you still suffering?
I actually, And evidence of this, I would say, is Jordan Peterson's reemergence. Recently, it happened just after we recorded our video, actually. He is as popular as ever, it seems. And it begs the question, well, how effective was he the first time around? Why are people still so hungry for 12 more rules to figure out how to fix their lives? It goes to what you're saying. I mean, it's perhaps that isn't the sort of answer to the complexes that you instinctually thought you wanted answers to. Because if JBP can come back and sell 10 million more books and have people around the world saying how much they have needed them in their lives and how his absence has affected them negatively, it kind of suggests, well, you didn't really fix much the first time around, did you? Or maybe that's just a very cynical way to look at it. But I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
I do. I do. A little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so he's got 12 more rules now. And I think his full list is like 48. In Collected Work 16, Carl Jung writes about dogma and rules and how it is a very primitive, early, say, development stage of your animus, or again, as we call the relating function. It is still in a state of projection. So you can give a child, for example, a set of rules, and you say, obey the rules, and they obey the rules. It's like, great. You give a grown man or a grown woman a bunch of rules who've gone through development. They're like, that's not necessarily relevant. The ability to psychosocially adapt and relate is built in. It's actually a function. So to come out with 12 more rules is not assisting whatsoever in anybody's anima, animus, or relating development. It's simply saying, here's a bunch of ways in which you can constrain your behavior. It doesn't encourage development at all. I think that, and Carl Jung would certainly say that. It might seek to contain. And I think that's what we're seeing with Jordan Peterson's fans, is they are contained by his image. But the issue with being contained is, okay, you're contained, but are you going up or are you going down? And how long are you being contained for? Is anything actually happening? And then you look at what happened with Peterson, and, you know, someone who has, it's difficult to say. I mean, no disrespect to the man whatsoever, but his recent fall and then rise again, but his recent fall does make you think as to why people might be following him and where you might be following him to.
Yeah.
It concerns me in a humanitarian way for other people. And that's not for Jordan Peterson, the man, at all. That's the phenomenon we are observing, which has its own thread through a massive cultural complex that he acts in opposition to. And so people go, okay, we go with that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, he's, you know, and then the way that kind of stuff is explained in Jungian circles is, well, he's channeling the archetypes, like Nietzsche was channeling the archetypes. It's like, no, you're not channeling the archetypes. What you're doing is you're building a psychological containing vessel through which you can look at it and say, this is me to me. On maps of meaning, you look at it and go, this is a way to explain me to me. Great, it contains you. But your instincts are still pushing, and you exist in a timeline that's going to keep going forward and forward and forward. And if there is a fundamental split, if you do have a fracture line, like, for example, Carl Jung, the man, certainly did, he worked in the Burke-Holsley, then, you know, you never know when that thing's going to go. And so, you know, humanitarian concern comes out for people who are interested in that type of stuff, the more philosophical side of stuff, because it doesn't seem to help. It's not the Greek philosophy way of things. It's Nietzschean philosophy, and Nietzsche did not go very well.
No, he didn't live a great life, did he?
No,
you can't not separate someone's actions from their words, you know. But nonetheless, it's too much of a thread to go down. I wanted to comment. You brought up Nietzsche. Nietzsche said something. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this was Nietzsche, that like every man must kill their father, which is essentially just a paraphrase of saying you have to move from, you have to step out from the shadow, the control, the, you know, the idolization, the help. You have to remove yourself from the father. And I imagine there is something similar with the woman and the mother as well. But perhaps you want to talk about that a bit, because I just found that really fascinating. I mean, Nietzsche came before Jung, and he's talking about this idea, which kind of suggests that this might be an instinctual thing that's good for us. You know, if it's been said many times,
it is.
You know, it doesn't mean you don't love your father. It certainly doesn't mean you don't kill him, obviously, but it means you can still admire, respect, love, rely on all the same ways. Well, not all the same ways. You can still do that, but you have to become your own individual that's separated from the father. You know, do you want to talk about this?
Yes, yes, certainly. Topic very, very. I've worked a lot on this with people. Is one of the things that animates me most, and talking to young guys about this in particular, perhaps because I was, in similar situations before. However, it's meant metaphorically, it's meant symbolically, and so the way, for example, Nietzsche might have meant that, and the way Jung meant that, and just because we brought him up, the way Peterson mentions that, are very, very different things. So Jung's one was meant clinically, and Peterson's one is based philosophically. For example, rescue your father from the belly of the whale. That's very different to kill your father. And of course, he means as the great father in culture, and his is opposition of the postmodern or whatever takeover. So it's don't throw everything away and burn it up. Okay. In instinctual terms, there's a time and a place for the influence of your father to confirm you as a man, and to be, for example, and with women, to be that filter and to shape that filter through which they can view the outside world, and in particular, at least for the apex of evolutionary biology, men. So that's great. The father has a role, a very, very important role, but there comes a time you need to separate from the father. And yes, it does. It comes out in dreams. It comes out in mythology, in ways that shouldn't be taken literally, presumably in the modern world. That killing your father. Because killing your father, you might think of as the ultimate in confirmation. You're in the most visceral sense, most animalistic sense. You're more of a man than your father was. That's devoid of all relating, and it's completely unnecessary. But as an image, that's what that means. It's basically I need to separate, or really kill the attachment to my father. And the father complex, or the way that your father experienced on the world, if it was positive, who cares? That's great. There is no imperative for every human being to destroy a father complex. But if it's bothering you, if you have experienced a narcissistic father, or if your father wasn't there to give you love, or if he encouraged you in one way over others, massively overamped, then those internalized behaviors that you're doing to seek unconsciously the father's approval, or to break away from the father, needs to be brought to consciousness so you can see things for how they are. Then you contradict it. You just contradict it in action and behavior. Then you've slain your father. So no encouragement to the audience to go off and cut people's heads off.
No, absolutely not. And it's also a good point to make that it's only if there is some sort of negative father complex that exists within you that might be a necessary action to do. It might be somewhere to orientate yourself. I suppose you're saying as well, like it's the most visceral thing you can do because you destroy your father. It could also just be the idea of your first sort of male masculine role model as a young boy in your life, is the father. And in a sense, it could be a way, it could just be another way of feeling like you are orientated down the right path and you're succeeding by maybe improving upon what that person did, because this was the first biggest influence in your life. And look, I've done more than, or now I don't know if maybe that's the wrong way to think about it, that you're doing more than or better than or anything like this. Maybe it's just that maybe the opinion of the person is no longer so important to me. I think that might be a very strong one for boys in particular. I don't know. Maybe I'm just projecting myself a little bit to it.
It's important for a little boy or a young lad to have a dad or a daddy. But for an adult, you have a biological father. That's the way to think about it. And then it should be your moral choice. Really, for someone who's optimally adapted, it should be your moral choice to, if you want to, have a relationship with your father or not. And that's presuming there's not a complex they're tripping you up to go back, for example. That's all, really, because if you're still doing things under the influence of the father, then that's antithetical to individuation. And not meant in a mythic sense, meant to be becoming who you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
You don't want to,
the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I mean, you go up to a girl or whatever, and you're like, I have a father complex. She'd be like, excuse me? It was like, what? So yeah.
Yeah. Let's go back to the complexes just quickly, and re-look at what, perhaps if you're just a person watching this video or just generally in life, and you can identify anxieties that you have, and you can almost identify complexes you have from that. They don't have to be crippling neuroses or anything. Can you talk about, I know it's an unfair question and it's something that is hard to do, but can you talk about how you can redirect your energy towards finding the instinct that roots this complex? Almost, depth psychology DIY at home. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. That's the purpose of videos we have on the personal myth and the personal myth guide, which probably be out by the time we release this, I guess. So the standard way to do something like this, which is just as general instructions, safe, unless you feel like something's going wrong or you've been clinically diagnosed with something, back off. But just in broad, detached terms, you would do a working through process biopsychosocially over your current personal myth. What that means? Well, it's like, okay, you have symptom, and it's like, okay, let's track the symptom. So a complex will manifest. It's never really in one way. It's normally lots. So I bring up the example maybe because it hits close to home for lots of guys. It's like, I can't talk to women. It's like, but and I also have anxiety, and I also procrastinate, and I also do this. And then the self-improvement goes, oh, you need to meditate for 10 minutes. No, they're all probably connected down to usually mother or father or broadly parental complex. So what you could do is, in the personal myth, and it's explained better elsewhere, but really briefly, you can find the etiology or the cause of the complex, because those behaviors, as they're socially maladaptive, and there's a very, very, very small chance, overwhelmingly small chance, it's genetic and built into you, therefore it's state dependent memory learning behavior over your lifespan, or a complex will have been triggered by something. Now it could be an acute event, it could be a trauma, something happened, and then the complex formed to protect you.
But can it also be the accumulation of a lot of small events?
Definitely. That's the most common one. Most people experience what we could call clinically as traumas, but not necessarily so that they would manifest themselves out in a vicious complex. Because I would describe little anxieties and things like that. They are quite vicious things, because they preoccupy you and they're deeply unpleasant. So you would see where these things came from before and after. Who am I really meant to be underneath that? When you bring consciousness to these things, naturally you'll feel what what Jung described aptly, although it shouldn't be used as a distraction, alchemy taking place. Most of the time, it reminds me when I was doing my own personal myth, and people who've close to me non-professionally going through their personal myths, and they come away in sometimes strange moods. They discover memories that they didn't know they had. Or they'll be like, I'm incredibly sad, or I'm incredibly happy, or it's like, I imagine, I'm not a particularly musical person, but I imagine it's how a musician might feel, after composing a song or trying to get into an emotional state for a song. They come away and they're like, there's emotion there. That's the first key, affect or emotion that you find. You can think theoretically about a complex. It's like, okay, so you've tracked things back, maybe you found an event, maybe you've realized consciously through the theoretical framework, which is the most important thing to put on top first, the theoretical framework, that maybe my relationship with my mother was a bit weird. Maybe I didn't like that very much. Or my father, maybe I didn't like that very much. You can hold that there as theory, and learn as much theory as you can, as long as it doesn't distract you, can help you. But when emotion comes up, that's your key. Because emotion links you to the personal myth. It links you to your through line, your genomic self, your instincts underneath. To look at things purely clinically and be like, I should do this. That's why self-improvement doesn't work. To be completely frank, it's why it doesn't work. There's no emotion there. If you can connect to the emotion, then you can go down into instinct. And then it will come up. These things become complicated. That's roughly what you do. And you can look to yourself to be, most of the time the solution to these problems is simply better psychosocial relating. You need to relate better to other people as like the first thing. But oftentimes you need a forensic investigation, and it usually lands you at mother or father or something else along those lines. That's Freud formulated his Oedipal complex as one of the central parts of his model. It's one of the things he observed most frequently in his clinical practice. And we've repeated that through depth psychology right up to this day, normally to do with the parents in some capacity. And so it's just find the affect and then remove that attachment, bring consciousness to it, understand it, but you don't understand it theoretically per se, you understand it emotionally as well, if that helps.
No, look, it really does. It really does. And I'm conscious of the time, but I just want to ask one more thing about complexes before we move on to the shadow. But I'm thinking as well, the ultimate goal is to defeat the bad complex that is either set by your mother or your father, right? But that's such a lofty goal that I'm afraid it might not even be attainable for most, especially if you're not seeing someone and all this sort of stuff. Is there a way you can steadily chip away at a complex, right?
Yeah.
Rather than just what you've been saying, like find the instinct, find the emotion, follow it to the instinct, and then blow it out of the water. Can you chip away at it?
Yes.
Great. I just speaking personally, I think that's something I'm sort of doing, but like maybe you can talk a bit about that. What does the chip away process look like? Because we all, if an anxiety equals a bad complex, you know, obviously there's good anxieties, you run away from the predators and such, you know, and if we want to put that in modern day speak, I have an anxiety for a deadline, or, you know, an anxiety to, uh, you know, do good work, so forth. They can be good anxieties, but then the bad anxieties, you know, like, oh my God, what did I say to this person? You know, how is she feeling
Ah,
about me? You know, are my parents proud of me? You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like these sort of things. Tapping away at these. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah. The main way you can go do that, and this is more dangerous,
Mm,
and it should be done under clinical supervision. But in broad, in broad terms, the theory anyway, it's you build a counter complex essentially. So you would so you can imagine a complex. It would be stored genetically, without a doubt. So it would be expressed biologically. We'll say that it creates RNA or protein. You create a counter complex that just say at the level of RNA. We don't know if it is at the level of RNA. So it will be. We don't know if this is the mechanism, but it's useful for illustrative purposes. You'll produce RNA or a nucleic acid. The counter complex will just produce one that's complementary to it. So you produce a complex, and then the counter
mm,
complex comes along and goes sticks to it because they match perfectly. That's how the
mm-hmm.
nucleic acids work, and then they can't work anymore. They just sort of stick together, and the behavior, the acted out behavior later is gone. I quite like molecular biology things. That's
Yeah.
my
Okay.
molecular biology complex coming out, because that
Yeah, I'm
you
not
can
sure
see you
if
can
it
see in
adds
real
simplicity
time.
to the discussion.
Well, yeah, you can see in real time how it's like, okay, push that out.
Uh-huh.
But to build a counter complex, you know, for example, you well, there's many of them in, say, self-development spheres. You have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, for example. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the alarm goes on at 6 a.m. and you're like, I can't get up. And you know, maybe you can, but then maybe you've also slept for 10 hours and you're incredibly healthy. You know, your metrics are all there. Why can't you
Mm-hmm.
get up? Well, it'd be psychological. Tiredness is often, in many ways, is most commonly actually psychological or psychobiological at the very least in its
Mm.
etiology. You
That's
can
really interesting.
create an internal belief system, if you like, that counteracts that complex. So, for example, if you go and you listen to a motivational video on loop all day, you'll probably get up the next morning.
Mm.
That's in broad terms how you can chip away at it in terms of
Okay.
baseline theory. You create something that counteracts it.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to an anxiety around women, you can do, or about your parents, you can do the exact same thing. This is one of the reasons why people turn to gurus, because they form counter complexes. You go and you approach women, and then you've got, say, no disrespect to the guy, just as an example, RSD
Mm.
Tyler, and you can suddenly get his voice in your head as a complex that counteracts that complex. So you've got the mother complex, for example, saying you can't talk to women, you belong to me. And you've got RSD Tyler going, oh, babe, go on, be a real man. And they cancel each other out. So you can actually
Yeah.
go talk to the woman. But then if
Interesting.
you get rejected, the mother complex gets powered up more, and then RSD
Right.
Tyler's eaten
Right.
away. But if you accept her, then RSD Tyler comes up. But neither way is it really you. So counter complexes can be used to permanently get rid of things,
Mm.
permanently get rid of neuroses, especially if done through hypnotherapeutic means. That's the best way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think people who've experienced hypnosis as well on themselves will be like, that's very strange how that worked.
Mm.
But I would personally say, don't necessarily try that at home as a first
Right.
port of call. I would say get to know yourself better. Get in touch with who you are over your autobiography would be better.
Yeah.
And look at where you're maladapted, rather than what you feel should be right and feel should be wrong. That's complexes that might be diverging you. Go down into the Brothers Grimm, Darwin and Freud. You've got to be radically honest with yourself, and lots of people don't like to hear it.
Mm.
And think to yourself and feel to yourself, what am I under instinctive pressure to do?
Yeah.
And then if you're not doing those things, then you can look at potentially the cause of why you're maladapted, and then you can pull the timeline back. It's explained well on the Jung To Live By channel by Steve and Pauline, and any videos in the Personal Myth playlist will be very, very helpful for this.
And it also sounds like, you know, taking a hard look at yourself and actually finding where the maladaptations are. I don't know if that's necessarily like it's certainly not an easy thing to do, but also maybe not even a possible thing to do, because of the way that your ego is influencing the way that you're writing down the ideas onto the page. Maybe you can't really see your own maladaptations. This is why I'm really excited to take the personal myth guide that Jung To Live By is going to give out. I don't want to, no shill, no cheeky plugs or anything like that. But I am very keen to see that when the hardcover comes out and buying it. But nonetheless, and like what the Jordan Peterson's self-authoring process is like. I mean, these are ideas that, like you've just said, to try and identify where the maladaptations are, to then be more targeted about how you're fixing them. But something else interesting you just mentioned with the counter complexes. You used the example of this Tyler bloke. Doesn't that sort of give an explanation for the popularity of self-help?
Yeah.
Maybe instinctually people don't even realize, but they're trying to fix a complex by jumping onto the counter complex, and maybe for a lot of people it's doing very good. Like there might be something worth to be said there, because then again,
it's always nuanced.
Exactly. It's always nuanced.
There is efficacy to gurus. Just, if
yes,
that's what you're asking.
Exactly. But then obviously it's the overattachment. There's I think you said it quite good at the end. If you do go to talk to this girl and you've got the counter complex in your ear and then still fail, well, now you need to, and now your complex has increased in strength. You need to now find a counter complex that is of equal strength. And if you keep failing, there's going to come a point where there is no counter complex that's going to be able to deal with this problem you have. And you want to be able to speak to women. You have to confidently be able to approach women and to approach strangers. It's it's one of the most fundamental things of life, which funnily enough, just no one can do. No one can do, such an exaggeration. A lot of people really struggle to do.
Take a 15-year-old guy or girl, and they might have an ego identified complex that says, I'm a procrastinator. Mm-hmm. That is a complex, because you're not a procrastinator, you're a human being. And then you're like, how am I going to get rid of this? How am I going to get rid of this? I know, I'll listen to Gary Vaynerchuk on loop for the next 3 months, and it works. You're not a procrastinator anymore. You're like, hell yeah. It's like, well, yeah, because that actually did have efficacy in the moment. But the problem to that is Gary Vaynerchuk formed his own complex, by definition, a counter complex. For sure. Yeah. Which means that, and who knows where that's going to go? That might simply be eaten up by the psychological immune system and going, okay, time and a place, off, or you might get very attached to him as a father imago. It might be accrued to the outer shell of another complex. You've no idea. But I want to say this might be, I think this is hopeful for people, and it's probably important to say, potentially what someone, because, if someone's come to this and they are anxious or anything like that, we are talking in quite deep and I think theoretical terms a lot of the time, trying to bring in practicality, but that doesn't help alleviate someone's suffering per se, because if everyone knows what it's like to suffer. So just something on that. The depth psychology framework is clinical, as I said at the beginning of this, and most of the time people don't need to see a clinician. You only go see a clinician when you feel that urge inside you, or you get recommended to go there. Most of the time people will come out of neuroses. They're almost like growing pains. An example I mentioned on our last our first conversation together was I was very, very shy up until I could have my first girlfriend, and the shyness disappeared. And it's like, that's an example of a complex being blown out of the water by connecting to instincts. You might find a great friend. That helps, because now you can be confirmed by a peer group. You might go off to university and suddenly you feel more confirmed that you're at university. Say like the great father or whatever is now confirming you, temporary or whatever. As you ever fluctuate the psychosocial environment, unless there is a real a neurosis of sufficient magnitude, maladaptations can be naturally cleaned up by themselves. And even therapeutically, you don't necessarily need, as a moral commandment of the universe, to do your own personal myth. Yeah. You needs a very bad word to be throwing around to use. For example, hypnotherapy is such a brilliant therapeutic method, because the person who's the patient doesn't necessarily have to do very much. Sure. For example, smoking cessation can be done in one session. You just sit down and the person can get you to quit smoking. You're like, wow. Now you might go do smoking cessation, then you come out of it and your smoking goes up. That's fairly common. Like, what the hell? Or you actually drop something else instead. Say you drink and smoke. You might drop drinking instead, and your smoking goes up. You're like, what the hell? Then that can then become an invitation to be, what the hell's going on? The complex that's sitting on top of your ego that goes, I am a smoker, is going, we quit that at least. It's like, then it can become more difficult. But there are multiple ways to do it. It's nothing to be scared of or put off by. Just in case, I was a little bit worried talking earlier. It might be sound like there's an imperative in what I'm saying. I wouldn't mean it like that whatsoever. most of the time these things will clear up by themselves unless it's something that will concern a clinician.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, if the complex isn't actually dominating your life and you don't even sort of realize you might have these complexes, they mightn't be so bad. If you really want to go in and optimize 100%, then maybe you're going to try and figure them out. But yeah, it's true that you're not all broken and need fixing, like that's definitely worth saying. Let's talk about the shadow, James. Let's talk about the shadow, because the complex is level 1 and everything above it is included in the complex. Okay. But what is something that contributes to this complex? Maybe the biggest contributor is the shadow. Just to kick us off on the shadow, James. Carl Jung said it himself, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. So there's a lot to say about the shadow. I think that's a really nice way that Carl Jung speaks about the urgency of recognizing your shadow. But it contributes to complexes. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So yeah, that is definitely the shadow is most important to remember because of the inductive way that is written and the way the shadow is often described. That the shadow is what was discovered through clinical means and was applied in a clinical way. It is not the most relevant clinical concept. That would be instincts, complexes, and the relating function.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, you can sort of just you're aware of the shadow, but you normally don't focus on it. It doesn't come up. Because the shadow can be the work of adaptation can be put forward by other psychodynamic processes. But broadly, what you can consider the shadow to be is the personal unconscious. So we defined complexes earlier as state-dependent memory, learning, behavior. It's like, well, where are they going to be? You're going to be unconscious of them, unless they're going to be ego aligned or ego I identified. Are they sitting right on top of your ego where you can't see them, or they become your identity? Then they can sit in the shadow. They can sit in the personal unconscious, or what is called the shadow. So there's lots in there. If I say it's the circle of, and then you probably, yeah, exactly. So where the hell did that come from? It's like, well, that was in your personal unconscious, or we could say your shadow.
Yeah.
So neither good nor bad. It's just a thing.
Is that's an interesting point. So your conscious personal unconscious, the personal unconscious that you can recall, can that also contribute to the shadow? It was my understanding that the shadow is everything that is in your unconscious which you cannot recall, because everything you experience exists there, but because of your ego, you only experience so much. And I think you said that actually really well as well, where the shadow can sit right on top of the ego, which means you can be acting out. The shadow can be a part of you, but you don't even realize because it's sitting right on top of the ego. Are you saying that the shadow can also be a part of the personal unconscious that we recognize, like my memories?
I would say actually the easiest way in would be to say that the two are the same thing, that the personal unconscious and the shadow are the same thing. Now, that's then okay. What does that really mean? I would encourage people to this, rather than be a cheeky plug or a cheeky shill. I would encourage people to download the Shadow Integration Manual. I say that because of the diagrams that are in there, because it gets quite difficult. The shadow is possibly the most difficult to understand concept, possibly.
Okay.
Because it's a system, and the shadow sitting as a concept, and you say lift the shadow out of the psyche, means nothing. It's the same thing as if you lift the ego out of the psyche, it means nothing, or the relating function, or the self. It doesn't mean anything. They're interacting subsystems, and the key thing with the shadow, like the ego, is, and this might shock people, but the ego is a complex. The ego is the nuclear complex of the field of consciousness. It's got pride of place, but it's a complex. And what holds it together is the phenomenological experience of I. So it's pride of place. And then obviously that can then shift depending on what complexes that you have, what identity that you have. But behind in the shadow, you've got memories in there, and you've got repressed character traits in there. You've got loads of things in there that you're not currently conscious of, but can still come out. If your shadow comes out, oftentimes you feel very embarrassed, or you might lash out in anger. That's something we broadly call the shadow. But when it comes to the shadow clinically or for self-development reasons, there has to be a place to begin, because otherwise it's just a C. And you're like, what the hell? I'll just think about kicking my dog. And it's like, well, that you need some kind of framework.
Yeah.
The thing you would focus on with shadow development, as is described in that manual, actually, is the alter ego, which is the nuclear complex of the personal unconscious, or the nuclear complex of the shadow. And what it does is it sits behind the ego, as you might describe, as you might think from the actual name. And what its job is to suggest to you, or to act out the opposite of what the ego is. In Jung liked his opposites and things like that, but this is actually a homeostatic balancing mechanism, rather than saying there's two things that can't be reconciled. It's like, no, they will. So you go about the world with an attitude, and your alter ego will contain a contrary attitude.
Okay.
And so the idea of shadow integration as a self-development or as a clinical tool is to say, okay, there's something in your shadow that's causing problems, or more likely, there's something that you're doing that's causing you problems. And then by integrating something from the shadow, that can get rid of the problem. So the problem can be on either side. That's why it becomes
exists in homeostasis.
Yes. So the shadow is not bad. So there are two things which can clear a lot of the shadow up. One, the shadow is not bad by definition, and or evil or dark. And two, you actually can't integrate the shadow. You can integrate the current contents of your alter ego, or the main part of your shadow, but you can't integrate the shadow. Reason being is it is a psychobiological structure. It's like saying integrate the anima. It's like, well, you can't. Think of it biologically in those terms. It's like, okay, you've got, say, this part of the brain, which you might say is the ego, or this part of the brain is the anima. I mean, obviously, it will get more complicated than that. But how could you integrate one biological system into another? You can't do it. It has to be information flow. That's the point with it. So it's a dialectic between ego and shadow, where contents can go from one side to another, one side, whatever. And then if you can imagine complexes, they could be sitting on the ego, around the ego, on the alter ego, around the alter ego, and they will start interacting in a system as well. So with the shadow, most of the time people will approach this as one of Jung's most popular ideas, and this is the thing to focus on. I would say no. I would say focus on complexes. And the shadow will slot into place naturally, and it'll feel at home amongst the sea of the theory of complexes.
I mean, that's very interesting, and also contrary to what is popularly known about the shadow, because my understanding of the shadow, and obviously it's now being influenced by what you're saying, but is that it is the sort of suppressed behavior, and it's the instincts that you had as a younger person that were told were wrong. It's the way it's the negative offset of the socialization process, and so all of the good ideas and good behaviors that you have the potential in equal depravity, but it's the shadow. And so for that reason, my understanding of the shadow is that it is a bad thing, and to integrate it is simply just for the purposes of making conscious the unconscious influence the shadow might have on your life. By making it conscious, then you're in, become more of an individual in full control of your. So if you frame it that way, then can the shadow then be a bad thing? Because what's the positive aspect of the shadow?
It can be. It can be. Well, okay. So like anything, by default, to ascribe any kind of morality just at baseline to any psychodynamic system, it's like you're in a different realm then. Because morality is not instinct. Morality is not a psychology thing. Morality is human behavior. That's very, very different. Then we're projecting it back onto our own systems. Things can either be good or bad based on adaptation. So there can be bad things in the shadow. There could be nasty things in the shadow. You might have repressed nasty things, and whatever. But the shadow can be very good. It can be lovely. There could be what the Jungians call the gold in the shadow, which is your potential in the broadest possible terms. So you might have repressed something in the past that goes into the shadow, and then it can come back out again, and it can go back in again. So it's not neither good nor bad. At baseline, it's a dialectic, and the best way to think of it for self-development terms is your potential. Now, if you say you've repressed a particular character trait, then how do you integrate that? That's then the work of complexes. That's then the work of relating. That's why there would be contents in the shadow, but to integrate the contents of your shadow usually requires an unusually large amount of self-reflexivity, because it's behind you. The moment you think you know what your shadow, you don't know what your shadow is.
Yeah,
till it becomes
that's a really good point.
You can't. You
You
know?
can't know it. Yeah. Which complements what you said about the individuation being the holy grail myth, because you can never actually achieve it, because fundamental to achieving it is integration of the shadow, and you can never integrate the shadow, because that's actually a good way to put it. As soon as you think you've integrated it, all of a sudden it's back there again. Like,
Yeah.
but I suppose another I'm just looking here at the notes I made, another under the subheading of dangers of the shadow. But I think another reason, or people do think, that the shadow is a bad thing, like it is the sort of harbor of all of your destructive potential, your evil potential. I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about it in Maps of Meaning. He was sitting at a table. I'm not sure if you remember this, but then he envisioned himself picking up the pen and stabbing the person in front of him. Which I thought was actually quite a brave thing to write down, because people are going to look at you and say, "Wow, you're a crazy guy." But if I'm honest, I have before been like, "Wow, I could hurt this person." I wouldn't do it, but you've definitely thought it, right? And then that is the contents of the shadow, almost. And when the shadow takes control of you, it's when you act out on one of those things. Now, Carl Jung says here, I took a quote: "He never suspects that his own hidden and apparently harmless shadow has qualities whose dangerousness exceeds his wildest dreams." I think, now Jung loves a bit of flavor when he writes. So there is, it's quite hyperbolic, exceeds
Mm.
his wildest dreams. But
Mm.
there is, I think this contributes to the idea that the shadow is necessarily bad. It's necessarily the antithesis to your good, you know?
Yes. In the spirit of this particular conversation, the way people come to learn about the shadow, or the way the idea of the shadow, is its own cultural complex. It's not the thing in and of itself. The map is not the territory or whatever. It's like it's not the actual psychodynamic system. So to be, because Peterson romanticized it there and Jung romanticized it there, and both would have their own reasons, presumably conscious, though not necessarily, for doing it in that way. And it's like the more and more and more you would say, give it, I've seen, for example, Peterson give an exercise to his Maps of Meaning, his personality class, I think, which is imagine yourself as a Nazi camp guard, and you can do it, and you can do it, and you can do it. It's kind of like, to me, that's a bit weird. I get what he's trying to do. I get it. I really, really do.
Yeah.
That there are, you're not a perfectly good moral human being. Absolutely. Absolutely. But a strange preoccupation on the shadow that you see in this cultural complex that people see is a little bit worrying to me, when the solution to a lot of these problems is relating, living properly, becoming who you're meant to be, and then to focus on the dark, evil, communism, Adolf Hitler. So maybe I will kill my dog and eat him later. It's like it's not it's a moral problem. It's a moral concern.
Sure.
My concern as a clinician would be, are you complaining of any problems? Are you happy? Are you adapted? And the shadow is a useful concept for that. But then you have to bring in complexes. And what I don't see ever, pretty much ever actually, is people who talk about the shadow also talking about complexes. And you actually can't do that, because it means that the shadow is a mythological, purely psychological system where you can integrate it and become yourself. That doesn't mean anything. It's hypnotic, and it's a hypnotic induction for someone watching it, because you actually don't have a practical step as to what to do, or what that means, or that necessarily looks like. It doesn't mean there's not a core that they're right about in terms of theory, but you've got to be careful that you don't form your own shadow complex when you study the shadow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's like,
That's an interesting point. I think to frame it with complexes, and like you said at the beginning, it would be better to do complexes first. I totally understand now why. I think what my understanding of the shadow is essentially the complexes. Like it's like a shadow projection could be synonymous with a negative complex to a degree. Just in the way it's acted out in the world.
Yeah, so then we got to do. I think I mentioned it earlier, dialectical syncretism, a way to sort of put two ways together. So my understanding of the shadow, based on my learning from Steve and Pauline and their clinical tradition, that's a long line. And say, for example, with yours, you would have learned about it from different places. To sort of put them together, I would say, yeah, roughly, basically. A shadow projection in and of itself is a real thing. You can project the shadow onto somebody, onto groups, onto anything. Usually, the classic example is someone has a trait that that you have latent in you,
Yeah.
and they're parading around all over the place and they're doing better than you, then you go, I hate you. And it's like, well,
Mhm.
why? It's like anxiety in that
Yeah,
sense. It's a
yeah,
signal to get you
totally.
to pay attention. But for most people listening, the shadow is not going to be their problem.
No.
The problem is going to be complexes, relating function, and instinct.
Yeah, and you know what? Another thing as well, like there's a sexiness to the shadow. There really is, you know, because the promise of integration of the shadow is you become the Ubermensch of unlimited potential because now you've integrated your dark side, you know, and it's like perhaps if you were just left to your pure instincts, you wouldn't always be acting out in terrible, depraved, negative ways anyway. You know, your shadow doesn't necessarily have to have the capacity of a Nazi prison guard. That doesn't have to be your antithesis. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
Exactly.
like,
If,
so
if 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 your alter ego was a Nazi camp guard, then you're by extension saying that
you've
you're a
got a big
saint.
complex. You've got a
Yeah.
massive complex. Yeah. And
If your alter ego is just the opposite, then you're walking around saying that you're a saint. And if you're walking around saying that you're a
mhm,
saint, by
mhm,
definition or psychodynamic, you have a massive, massive
yeah,
shadow.
yeah.
And then, maybe that would explain why someone might be preoccupied with the shadow. They've got such a one-sided, narrow, theoretical viewpoint
Mhm.
of themselves and their belief system that there's so much shadow pressure that builds up that they're actually, in thinking about the shadow, they're possessed by the shadow. And if you're possessed by the
Yeah,
shadow, you're going to be doing, you think you're doing one thing, but you're actually doing another. And then
yeah,
you will spread it. And it's like that then becomes dangerous, very,
yeah.
very dangerous.
Certainly.
So consider the shadow just for psychological hygiene purposes, because it is so inductive, as your potential. That's
Yeah.
it. You've got potential in there. There's gold in there, and you're going to find it because something's back there.
Mm.
No need for Nazi camp guards or anything like that.
I really I do prefer looking at it through the prism of complexes, you know,
Mm.
and having complexes to be to for them to be explicable through looking at your own experience, identifying the problems, and touching
Mm.
base with the instincts. You know, but then you start getting a little bit away from Jung because there is such a seductive sexiness to the idea of Carl Jung, the idea of, you know, Eric Banner and the Hulk, and what if Eric Banner could become the Hulk? He'd be the ultimate person in the universe. Like we can all be this. To fulfill your potential, you just need to integrate the dark side. It's like there might be a bit more to it. There might be a bit more to it than that. But that's a nice, easy
Here's a
prism for you to sell
potential.
books through. You know.
Well, it is, and most of the time it's later Carl Jung, and I do understand it. I do understand people's interest in it, but maybe here's a vaccine against that. As someone who was individuated would have no interest in a fantasy like that.
Mm.
So in terms of, I wonder if I've got a dark side, they wouldn't care
True.
because they'd be
Yeah.
living the life they were meant to be living.
Yeah.
You know, but I get it. It's not. It is exciting, but it's not a nice suggestion to give yourself. Jung forms his own complex by definition, really, because it's state-dependent memory learning behavior. But it's the style of ideas.
Yeah.
Nietzsche forms his own complex, and then as we understood complexes, that can then go on and shape you and your happiness and your relationships and everything, while you think you're going about integrating the shadow, when actually you don't, in strict terms, necessarily understand as a system what the shadow is. You understand what the shadow is through the complex lens of your Jung complex. And then it's like, what the hell is going on? When it's like, I
things are
agree
getting
with you, mate. I
very
agree with
messy.
you. Instinct.
Mhm.
That's the way to go.
Let's talk about projection. So I think a lot of my questions might be relatively redundant now, but I think what's really interesting to look at is group projection, and the phenomenon that Carl Jung suggested, that because projection is a part of yourself you don't like, you put onto another person to then give you the excuse to hate them. Like it's this shadow projection. You could also, as a group, as a society, project onto another group, another society. And this is usually the fodder for massive, wars, for lack of a better word. And the classic example is the Jewish race became a group projection of the Nazis. I don't know if there's anything worth commenting on that.
Yeah. Well, a baseline, a projection. It's easy to forget this actually, but a projection is a part of your own psyche that you can just see, basically. So, you know, the classic, the anima projection, it's like, I've fallen in love with you. It's like, maybe you have, or maybe you've actually narcissistically fallen in love with yourself, which I one of the things I find quite amusing for some reason. But if, you know, projecting, you can project onto anything really. And then it's, you know, so that's what I can really say, a baseline of what that is you're looking at a part of yourself. It's not about that, because you're not seeing it as a human being. So you know that you're not projecting onto somebody when you can see them as a human being. You know, transference and projection, for example, overlap massively. And that's the thing. It's like, have you got a transference onto somebody? It's like, well, do you see them as a human being? Really honestly. And if you go, no, then you're like, okay, there's something being projected. Because it's not human, it's an inanimate part of the psyche, basically. But yeah, you can project pretty much any psychodynamic system. You know, you can introject as well. That's very common, especially the one I like to talk about with that is like Nietzsche's writings. You can introject whatever the hell you want into Nietzsche's writings. That's not to take away that Nietzsche was saying something. It means everyone's got a different interpretation.
Yes,
again, I find quite amusing.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, or you can
he can be used to
identify
argue so many different points.
Yeah. And
it's an idea of him.
Yeah, it's like, well, Nietzsche meant this, he meant this, he meant this, he meant this. Actually, probably meant none of them. He probably meant his own thing, but you're reading yourself into it, because he writes in a hypnotic way as well. And, you know, and the image of Nietzsche as well. So I know obviously we want to talk about complexes and the shadow and stuff like that today. One of the things that comes up is psychological hygiene, because it might, you know, if you label the video how to have psychological hygiene or something like that, it might not, that's not particularly exciting, but it answers a lot of the questions about the complex and the shadow in the first place, because it then directs you immediately away from fluff and gets you, and I think intuitively, if we've done a good job in the dialectic, to intuitively point towards where someone's meant to go, you know?
Yeah. Did you have anything about the group projection you wanted to say, though? Because I know earlier you said maybe there was something interesting about that. If not, it's no problem.
Oh, there are loads and loads and loads of things. The thing that comes to mind with groups is immediately a difference between the anima and the animus, in that say if a man has an anima dream, in broad terms, you know, I think colloquially people understand what that means. Usually a woman will appear to him, but if a young woman will have an animus dream, it's a group of men.
Okay,
that's one thing, because that doesn't necessarily sound exciting. If you really consider what that might be, and the role of the mother and the father, you can then see precisely how men and women at the deep relating level are totally different creatures. Which I just leave that out as a potential.
Yeah, leave it there.
A better homework for people to look into.
So we're talking about projections, you know, similar to what we were commenting on before of how you can identify a bad complex and then try and figure out how to get to the root of it. Is it as obvious to identify a projection? Because this is something I consciously really try to do sometimes. You know, a lot of the times I'm too lazy to notice or care or try or whatever. But sometimes I really consciously try, like, why am I in such a foul mood? And why did that particular comment, or why does this particular behavior really rub me such a bad way when it hasn't before? You know, and I really try to figure it out. But for me, it's not very obvious when it's me projecting something of myself that I don't like, or it's just like, that's shit. You know what I mean? It's hard to identify the projection, in my experience. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, it takes reflexivity, which is the marker of ego strength. I don't think it's particularly difficult to identify necessarily that you've had a projection of some kind. I think with a little bit of experience and being reflexive about it, you could probably realize that, wait a minute, I really need this person, and when this person is gone, I feel terrible. It's like, well, then you've probably projected onto them something that you perceive to be actually positive. And it's the same thing with like a negative thing. The negative projection, even the difficult thing would be, where is that projection coming from? Because to project, nothing's going out into the outside world. It's just there's an affect drawn to that image that correlates with something on the inside that's a psychodynamic system. So there's a resonance there. So it's like, well, where the hell's that coming from? And for that would require work on the personal myth. That would require looking at that particular person and what their influence is over you, why they have an influence over you, because they don't necessarily have to be in, say, like a father or mother role. They can have influence in another way. Like, to have a shadow projection onto somebody gives them power, because you're drawn to them. Your libido is drawn to them. So they suddenly become a problem to solve. So their image has power over you. It's to know yourself as much as humanly possible. And in with projection, I would include introjection and identification at the same time in there. And ideally, you don't really want any of those things. You want to be yourself. And so the more you get to know yourself, the more that true, as what was it Steve said the other day in the Jung To Live By Discord server, we're all just fellow fellow gardeners in the vineyard of the human soul. I like that.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's become closer to yourself, because you are going to project, you are going to interject, you are going to identify. It's a natural process. But as we discussed last time, consider all of these things not as evil things or things that shouldn't necessarily be there. Just consider them invitations.
Yeah.
Unless they're really causing you hell. But, yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that's as good a place to leave it as any. James, absolute pleasure, mate. Really love the fact that we get to chat like this. There was more to talk about. I really wanted to talk about the shadow and pop culture as well, and tons of other stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm sure we'll get another chance.
Definitely.
So again, thanks, mate. Absolute pleasure to have you here, and I look forward to doing it again. And of course, Jung To Live By, you got to get amongst it. The channel's amazing, the Discord's amazing. Get the personal myth journey, and also get the shadow integration manual. It's all going to be involved in the links. Mr. Dowling, Happy New Year as well. We didn't get to talk too much about the holidays and family. I hope everyone is really well. I stumbled my way through this one, but I really appreciate it so much, mate. I hope all is well.
No, it's all good. The pleasure's all mine. I really enjoy these, and I'm looking forward to part 3.
Amazing.